I too want to thank the Middle East Institute, and I want to thank all of you for having come here this morning to hear us. But having thanked you, I want to proceed to disappoint you. I know that when we're talking about armed non-state actors, and in the region of the world that I work on, the focus is really on Hamas and Hezbollah, and the question that people always ask, and the issue about which people get very quickly polarized, and I've been caught up in that debate, is shall we talk to them or not? Should we talk? Should the United States talk to Hamas and Hezbollah? I want to put that question to the side. I think that question has done more to pollute the debate, to divert attention from what the real issues are, than it has been a productive line of inquiry. That should be the end point, what we should do, whether we should talk to them. The first question should be to analyze where they come from, to analyze whether our policies so far have been successful in dealing with them, in achieving our own self-proclaimed objectives, and if not, then let's look at alternatives. And I think there's been a confusion of means and ends and a rush to judge the means, should we talk to them, rather than the ends, what are objectives when it comes to these non-state armed actors. And again, I will focus mainly on those two. And I'll focus on those two because they've become so much part of the political debate here. So the first question is whether, measured by the United States' own self-proclaimed yardstick, whether our policies towards Hamas and Hezbollah have been successful. Now, what have been the objectives? The objectives have been to weaken those movements. For example, the objective has been, in some cases, to defeat them militarily when it comes to Hamas and Gaza. The objective has been to get them to change their ideological posture, to accept the Quartet conditions. The objective has been to disarm them when it comes to Hezbollah in Lebanon. Now, on one issue after another, I don't think we really need to go down the list. But on virtually all of these standards, all of these measurements, I think the conclusion is relatively non-controversial that we have not succeeded. Hamas may be less popular today, but it is firmly entrenched in Gaza. It is not accepted and is not closer to accepting the Quartet conditions. It acts as a constant factor in the negotiations, making it harder to reach an agreement and making it harder for President Abbas to move forward, knowing that he has a powerful constituency that has powerful resonance among Palestinians and Arabs more generally, that is looking and staring behind his back. Hezbollah is no closer to being disarmed. In fact, it is probably more powerful today than it has ever been in its history, and it has strong, not just in terms of its weapons, but in its ability to paralyze the political process and the institutions in Lebanon. So on issue after issue, whether it was the goal of making them change their worldview, whether it's the goal of weakening their hold in Gaza or their power in Lebanon, whether it's the goal of strengthening their opponents, Fatah in the Palestinian case or March 14th Alliance in Lebanon, it is very hard to see in what way the policy has been successful. And that's the starting point for me. The starting point shouldn't be, well, should we talk to them, in which case all these other issues come up. The starting point should be whether so far, again, judged by what the administration, the Bush administration, and now to some extent the Obama administration, what they have stated as their objectives, whether the policy of isolation, marginalization, attempts to disarm or attempts to dislodge have been successful. And I think the answer is pretty clearly no. So let's take that as the starting point. And now let me offer a series of observations about these two movements, but even more broadly about non-state armed actors in the Middle East, to try then to reach a conclusion about what might be alternative approaches to them. The first observation is the fact that these movements over the past decade have become much more powerful, much more influential. Now, armed non-state actors are nothing new to the Middle East. I mean, for those who followed the history of Lebanon, this really looks like an old story. But there's something new about them, because in the old days, they were far more extensions of proxies of established states, established regimes. What seems to have changed is that these have become much more holistic. They have a much deeper national roots. They are acting often in conjunction with other states, but not on behalf of other states. And they have a much greater ability to appeal to their own local constituencies, not simply through the military option they offer, but through the social services that they provide, through charitable institutions, through the, as I say, a more holistic approach to their links to society. And that is a change that is a function in part of the decreasing power of the central state, about which we just heard something, and their ability to make up for the deficiencies of that central state. So that's observation number one, which is an increase in power, but also a change in their role in their domestic societies, and their ability to act independently of others. The second observation is that these cases, Hamas and Hezbollah, but also to some extent, and I won't get into too much, the Sadrist movement in Iraq, another case that we've studied at the International Crisis Group, all three movements have prospered precisely in societies that have an open wound, an unresolved question that polarizes their domestic constituencies in those countries, either questions about the nature of society, that's certainly the case in Lebanon, it was the case and is the case in Iraq as well, or a question of their relationship with a third party. Also the case of Lebanon vis-a-vis Israel and Lebanon vis-a-vis Syria, the case of the Palestinians vis-a-vis Israel. In all these cases, you have an unresolved, unaddressed existential issue which divides the polity and in which the non-state actor takes one side against the others. It's also cases, and all three have this in common as well, where a certain constituency, if not all people in those entities, feel a security threat that the state is not able to address. Again, certainly the case in Lebanon, and the experience of the Shiite community at the hands of Israel is one that is very, very profoundly entrenched in the psyche of Shiites, but of other Lebanese as well. It certainly was the case in Iraq, and it's the case in Palestine as well, where the Palestinian Authority, for all its achievements in some areas, has been singularly inept at protecting Palestinians from Israel. And that, of course, feeds and fuels the desire, the aspiration to have an organization that can defend and provide the kind of defenses that the central authority, or in the case of the Palestinians, the non-state authority can provide. Third observation, which also is a common trait of these three cases, is that these are the cases in which the U.S. has invested most heavily, particularly after 2000, most heavily to shape the polity, to, in some cases, accelerate the holding of elections, and has been generally most invested. I mean, that certainly was the case, again, of Iraq with the invasion. It was the case in Lebanon after 2005, where the U.S. very powerfully tried to go in, take sides in domestic struggles, and take sides with one against the other, and try to shape Lebanon in a certain way. And it's the case in Palestine to this day, again, really triggered by the elections in 2006, elections which the United States had been promoting. But again, in all these cases, it's interesting to see that where the U.S. has been deeply involved in trying to structure and shape society in a certain way, and the polity in a certain way, these non-state armed actors have prospered and flourished, in part, by playing off against this polarization of us against them. Of course, in their case, the us is very different from the us that President Bush had in mind.